All right, so it looks like we've got an update in this whole Big U, Brick Baby, Loose Cannon, Rolling 60's RICO indictment, right? I'm sure you guys are familiar with the situation. I'm not going to spend a lot of time going over everything that has happened, but we are getting some news, some information today that people have officially started taking plea deals in this case. Now, you might be asking, why is that important? Why does that matter? Because obviously, when people start taking plea deals, it means that they have admitted to committing the crimes that they are accused of. And in exchange for a plea deal, they basically have to admit that they are guilty. This ultimately will work against Big U and everybody else that was charged in this RICO, because when people take plea deals and admit that they actually had some involvement in whatever they're being accused of, obviously that's not going to look good when the other defendants go to trial. So today we are talking about this guy, Christian Forbes, aka Bus. You might recognize his name from the poster that the police showed to the press when this RICO indictment was first unsealed and everybody was getting arrested. He's right here down at the bottom right. And Christian Forbes was basically charged with selling firearms to people in the rolling 60s. Now, if you guys have been keeping up, you know that part of the government's indictment against Big U is that he was constantly in possession of firearms, even though he was a felon after catching a pretty lengthy sentence back in the 1990s. And the government has basically alleged that this guy, Christian Forbes, is the person that was providing firearms. Not only that, but Zahir Mitchell, also known as Brick Baby, has also been accused of obtaining and having firearms when he's not supposed to. Back just the other day, we talked about his gun case being pushed back to October. So apparently this Christian Bus guy is the guy that was providing firearms. And yesterday, paperwork was actually posted on Pacer confirming that this guy is the first person to take a plea deal. So we can see the case number here, CR240056, and that's the case number for Big U. That's the case number for Brick Baby, right? It's the same case number for everybody that's involved. And you can see it says plea agreement for defendant Christian Forbes, aka Bus. Okay, and the paperwork says this constitutes the plea agreement between Christian Forbes, also known as Bus, and the United States Attorney's Office for the Central District of California in the above captioned case. This agreement is limited to the USAO, that's the United States Attorney's Office, and cannot bind any other federal, state, local, or foreign prosecuting, enforcement, administrative, or regulatory authorities. And then it lays out his obligations for him to get this plea. It says defendant agrees to, at the earliest opportunity requested by the United States Attorney's Office and provided by the court, appear and plead guilty to the single count indictment, which charges defendant with engaging in the business of dealing firearms without a license in violation of 18 United States Code 922. He also agrees to not contest facts agreed to in this agreement, abide by all agreements regarding sentencing contained in this agreement, appear for all court appearances, surrender as ordered for service of sentencing, obey all conditions of any bond, and obey any other ongoing court order in this matter. He agrees to not commit any crime. He also agrees to, and this one right here is important, be truthful at all times with the United States Probation and Pretrial Services Office and the court. Y'all hear that? Y'all see what that says? He agrees to be truthful at all times with the United States Probation and Pretrial Services Office and the court. Now, I'm not saying that that implies that he has given them information, but it does say that he agrees to be truthful at all times. It also says that he is going to pay the applicable special assessment at or before the time of sentencing unless defendant has demonstrated a lack of ability to pay. And I think the special assessment fee is like $100 or something. But it says defendant further agrees to the abandonment to the United States of any interest of the defendant in the following firearms, ammunition, and accessories seized by law enforcement on or about March 23rd, 2022. And apparently they found him with a Glock Model 48 9mm caliber semi-automatic pistol that also had a gun case, a 38 special revolver bearing no serial number, commonly referred to as a ghost gun. He had approximately 130 rounds of ammunition and 4 firearm magazines that they found back, I guess, when he was first arrested in 2023. It says B, he also agrees to acknowledge that he is the sole owner of the seized asset and that no other person or entity has interest in the seized asset, and he's going to complete any legal documents, including the ATF Form 3400.1, which pretty much transfers ownership from him to the United States. It then lays out some of the United States Attorney's Office obligations when it comes to this plea agreement, and they basically agreed to not contest facts that are agreed to in this agreement, abide by all agreements regarding sentencing contained in this agreement, and And at the time of sentencing, they are going to provide that the defendant demonstrated an acceptance of responsibility for the offenses up to and including the time of sentencing. They are going to recommend a 2-level reduction in the applicable sentencing guidelines and recommend, if necessary, a move for an additional 1-level reduction if available at that time under that section. It gets into the nature of his offense. It says the defendant, Christian Forbes or Bus, understands that for him to be guilty of the crime charged in count 1, that is engaging in the business of dealing firearms without a license, the following must be true. First, Bus was willfully engaged in the business of dealing in firearms within the date specified in the indictment. And second, defendant did not have a license as a firearm dealer. His penalties are this right here. It says Bus understands that the statutory maximum sentence that the court can impose for a violation of Title 18 is 5 years imprisonment, a 3-year period of supervised release, and a fine of $250,000 or twice the gross gain or gross loss resulting from the offense, whichever is greatest, and a mandatory special assessment fee of $100. Bus and his counsel have discussed the fact that, and the defendant understands that if he is not a United States citizen, this conviction in this case makes it practically inevitable and virtually a certainty that he will be removed or deported from the United States. Right, and it goes on about that for a minute. I'm not sure if this guy was an immigrant or what, but they felt the need to put this in the paperwork. It says, in or around January 2022, Bus offered to sell a pistol to an individual he believed to be a potential firearms purchaser. On January 5th, he sold to the supposed purchaser a Smith & Wesson model M&P 45, a 45 caliber semi-automatic pistol, in exchange for $1,200. On January 12th, 2022, defendant similarly sold a Bursa model 383 380 caliber automatic pistol in exchange for $750. On February 2nd, 2022, defendant sold a semi-automatic rifle known as a ghost gun with a scope and of unknown caliber, along with the 60-round drum magazine, PMag D60 ammunition, and 10 rounds of PMag 10 magazine, 9 rounds of 223 rim ammunition, 56 rounds of 5.56 ammunition, and a black case laser attachment in exchange for $1,800. On March 10th, 2022, Bus sold a Taurus model GS2 9mm caliber semi-automatic pistol with 7 rounds of 9mm caliber ammunition in exchange for $1,250. Dang, bro was busting head. The Taurus GS2 ain't nothing but like $250. Bro sold it for $1,250. Damn, anyways, it said on March 23rd, 2022 in Carson, California, within the Central District of California, Bus possessed a Glock 9mm semi-automatic pistol, a 38 special revolver, various magazines and ammunition for each firearm, other calibers of ammunition, and a Glock gun box, all of which he possessed with the intent to sell. At the time, defendant sold and possessed with intent to sell all the foregoing firearms. Bus did not have a license as a firearm dealer. Bus made all of the foregoing sales in Los Angeles County within the Central District of California. Now, I don't know if any of these guns are the guns that Brick Baby was caught with or the guns that Big U supposedly had, but you can see they have a detailed report of the guns that he was selling to people. I'm imagining that these have something to do with the indictment, or they wouldn't be in the paperwork and bro wouldn't be pleading out right now. We'll have to wait and see, down the road how this specific information impacts the other people in this case. But like I said, as y'all can see, they have a lot of information about what bro was selling. He clearly sit down and told them what he was doing. It then gets into some sentencing factors for him. It says that he understands that in determining his sentence, the court is required to calculate the applicable sentencing guidelines range, to consider that range, possible departures under the sentencing guidelines, and other sentencing factors set forth in USC 18-3553. All right, and they basically gave him a base level offense of 12 because he sold 3 to 7 firearms. They added 2 and then they subtracted 2. And earlier we read that the United States Attorney's Office was going to give him a 2-level reduction because he's taking this plea, right? Making his total level of offense a 10. And these points or these levels that they're assigning to this case is just something that they do in all federal cases, right? They'll assign a base level offense number and then they will add on to that or subtract as needed in order for them to get a proper bearing on what the sentencing guidelines for whatever the crime is being convicted may be. So he did get a little bit of leniency, if you want to call it that, because they did remove 2 of his points. Anyways, he then goes on to waive some of his constitutional rights, like the right to persist in the plea of not guilty, the right to a speedy trial, the right to be represented by counsel, the right to be presumed innocent, the right right to confront or cross-examine witnesses, the right to testify and to present evidence in opposition to his charges, not to other people's charges. But right here, it says he also forfeits the right to not be compelled to testify. So they very well could call him up on the stand and compel him to give testimony about everything that he knows about. He waived his right to appeal his conviction. It then lays out what happens if he wants to withdraw his guilty plea after this agreement. And it pretty much says that if he tries to appeal this on any other basis other than the fact that the plea was involuntarily made, then the United States Attorney's Office will be relieved of all of its obligations under this agreement. It lays out what happens if he breaches the agreement, which is pretty standard in these type of things. And then he agrees to a bunch of pretrial conditions, and it lays out that, you know, the Office of Pretrial Services is not a party in this agreement. This is just between the United States Attorney's Office and BUS, and that there is no additional understandings, promises, or agreements between the United States Attorney's Office and this guy, right? And so this paperwork is super important because, like I said at the beginning of the video, this guy taking a plea, admitting that he was selling firearms to other people, and the fact that he was wrapped up in the Rolling 60's RICO leads me to believe that he was wrapped up in that RICO because of these offenses. He has now admitted to these offenses, said that I'm guilty of this happening. They know when he was selling the firearms, or what type of firearms he was selling, what type of magazines he had with him, the dates that he was selling them on, how much he was selling them for. And honestly, that is a lot of information. Now, nowhere in here does it say that this guy is going to testify against anybody, but I mean, he may not need to testify against anybody if in his plea agreement he is admitting to selling them firearms. This is not going to help Big U's case or Brick Baby's case or whoever the person is that he was selling these firearms to, because they also did not mention who he was selling them to. They just said that he was selling them, and we know they made a big deal in both Brick Baby and Big U's paperwork about them having firearms. So I can only assume that it's about one of those, even though it's not explicitly stated in the paperwork that those names are the people he was selling it to. It seems that it's only relevant if he was selling these firearms to those guys. So I think that this is pretty important paperwork. Not only that, this is the first guy in the entire case to take a plea. I assume that the dominoes will start falling after this. More and more people will begin to take plea deals. More and more people will begin to admit to the wrongdoing and giving the information about how it was all conducted. And in the long run, this does not help anybody in the case as far as winning their case. This is bad, you know, but this is the first domino to fall. We now know the government is offering pleas to people if they will admit to what they've done and give them information about how all of this worked. And man, at this point, we're just going to have to wait and see how all of this plays out. I thought it was pretty crazy, wanted to present it to y'all, but at this point, y'all got to let me know what y'all think about it in the comments down below. Anyways, that's basically it for the video, guys. If you enjoyed the content, be sure to hit the like button, subscribe, tap the notification bell so you get notified every time I upload a video. As always, it's been fun rocking with y'all, man. I'm out.